They told me the church burned by accident, but I know better. Fire does not choose by chance, it remembers. And when the embers came crawling across the wood, I swear they spelled my name in ash. The town said it was lightning, but I have lived long enough to know that God no longer sends signs, only reminders. I sit now in what remains of St. Harlow's chapel. The boards under my hands are soft, the pews are bones. Where hymns once rose, dust hangs in the air like smoke too proud to leave. I'm 84 years old, and I have come to speak the truth of what happened here, though my tongue trembles at the thought. It has been 50 years since the last voice was heard in this place. 50 years since I preached salvation and delivered only silence. In 1835, Alabama was heat and hunger. The riverbeds cracked, the crops rotted, and men began to mistake faith for fever. I was a preacher then, young, proud, certain that the Lord had chosen me. They called me the voice of Harlow, though I spoke words that came from no scripture I can now find. The nights smelled of iron and pine, and the candles burned lower each Sunday, as if the light itself had grown tired of my sermons. It was in those days I first felt the distance between my words and heaven. I would stand before the congregation, sweat rolling down my neck, and still no echo from above. The people trusted me, and I, God forgive me, trusted their fear. Faith became something I could hold, shape, control. I thought it power. It was only pride. The faces that looked up at me then, kind, frightened, faithful, they return to me now when I close my eyes. I still remember Mrs. Talley's trembling hand as she held her son during prayer, the child coughing blood onto his mother's hymn book. They begged me to intercede, and I said the fever was a test, that the Lord would cleanse those who stayed. I told them to keep their doors shut. I told them the outside world was cursed. Before I go further, if you wish to hear more of these forgotten confessions, stay with me. Subscribe and listen to the rest. For what I have to tell is not sermon nor story. It is penance. The church bell ceased one morning when the rope snapped in my hands. I took it as a message, though not the kind any sane man should follow. I told the congregation the silence meant we had been chosen, that God had turned his ear solely toward us. I preached louder, harder, until my throat bled, and my flock wept beneath me. I mistook their tears for salvation, but what I saw glistening on their cheeks that day was not faith, it was fear. Now, sitting among these ruins, I feel that same fear beneath my ribs. The kind that never leaves, the kind you bury, and that still grows roots in your sleep. The Lord once spoke to me in thunder. Now he speaks in quiet, and I fear what he will say when I finish speaking. I remember the summer the fever came. It crept through the town like breath through a keyhole, unseen but everywhere. The first to fall was a child, then two, then a mother whose name I have long forgotten, but whose scream still echoes when I close my eyes. We buried them on the edge of the chapel yard, near the line of sycamores that once shaded the dead. The ground was so dry it cracked when we pressed the crosses into it. I said the earth would drink their suffering. It only drank their blood. By the second month, my sermons turned desperate. The air inside the church was thick, heavy with sweat and prayer, both doing little to cleanse the rot that had begun to seep beneath the pews. The fever took Mr. Collins as he knelt in confession. His last breath fogged the altar like incense. I wiped his brow, whispered verses, and told the others it was mercy. But I knew mercy had not visited Harlow in a long time. The more they died, the more I preached. I believed the only sin greater than doubt was silence, and so I spoke until my voice rasped like wind through broken glass. I told them to stay within these walls, that outside was perdition. I locked the doors some nights to keep them from fleeing. I said it was for their salvation. In truth, I was afraid of being left alone with what I had done, One night, a storm passed through, and the thunder rattled the glass panes like fists demanding entry. I took it as a sign that God was near, but when I looked into the faces of those who remained, all I saw was hunger, madness, and despair. Children slept on the floor beside the altar, their breaths shallow. Mothers hummed hymns with cracked voices. The air stank of sickness and candle smoke. Every prayer I spoke dissolved into coughing. I began to see things too. Shadows that leaned too close to the pulpit, eyes glinting in the corners of the nave where no one stood. I thought they were demons sent to test me, but later I wondered if they were simply the dying lingering long enough to listen. I could no longer tell whether I preached to the living or the dead. At dawn, I carried out the bodies myself. Their skin was cold as rainwater. I dug shallow graves, whispering their names until they blended into one long word I could no longer pronounce. When I covered the last child, I fell to my knees and begged the Lord to take me instead. The wind answered, nothing more. There is a cruelty in silence that no scripture warns of. It fills the lungs, turns faith into stone. Even now, 50 years later, I can still taste that dust when I breathe. The fever passed eventually, but not before it took nearly everyone within these walls. When the townsfolk returned, those who had fled, they found me here, alone, my hands black with earth, the chapel doors sealed from within. They asked me what happened, but I could not speak. My voice had left me, as if God himself had reached into my throat and taken back the gift he once gave. That was the day they began to call me the silent preacher. I still wonder whether the fire that came later was heaven's punishment or mercy. Either way, it was an ending I did not deserve. I kept the chapel sealed for months after that day, living among the dead as if I belonged to them. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and mildew, the hymn books swollen with damp. I spoke no words. Not to God, not to myself. The silence became a kind of prayer, though I do not know to whom it was offered. When I walked the aisles at night, I could hear the boards groan beneath my feet like restless voices. They seemed to remember the weight of those who had once stood upon them, mothers, farmers, children with ribbons in their hair. Their absence pressed against the walls until even the dust seemed to hold its breath. I took to lighting a single candle each morning, placing it at the center of the pulpit. It was not for illumination. I could see just fine in the dark by then, but for remembrance. Each flame that burned out marked another day I was granted and did not want. I lived on stale bread and rainwater that seeped through the cracks in the roof. My reflection, when I dared to glance at it in the brass of the candlesticks, looked less like a man and more like a remnant. Sometimes I would hear footsteps outside, hesitant, soft. I imagined the ones who had fled returning, hoping to find something left of their faith. Once I opened the door and found only the field beyond, wet with fog. The graves had begun to sink, the earth taking back what I had tried so hard to preserve. I realized then that even the soil knew mercy better than I did. The fever never touched me, though I begged for it. It spared me as if to make me its witness. I think about that often, why I remained when the righteous fell. I had preached once that survival was a blessing. Now I see it is a sentence. In those months of solitude, I began to hear a different voice, faint, distant, coming from the pulpit itself. At first I thought it the wind, but it was too deliberate, too knowing. It spoke words I could not recall ever writing. Verses twisted into confessions, scripture turning against itself. "The shepherd keeps his flock," it whispered, "even when he feeds them to the fire." That was the first night I truly feared what I had become. When the winter came, frost crept along the chapel walls, outlining cracks like veins. I found myself tracing them with my fingers, feeling the brittle cold as though it could purify me. But sin, I learned, does not leave the flesh easily. It nests in the marrow, waits in the quiet between heartbeats. I sometimes wonder if they forgave me. Those I buried, those I locked inside, believing I was saving them. I dream of their faces, not as they were in life, but pale and still, lips parted as if they are about to speak my name. I wake before they do. One morning, when the candlelight failed to catch, I understood something dreadful, that the silence I had mistaken for penance was not holy at all. It was hunger. The walls wanted memory, the graves wanted voice, and I was all that remained to give them either. I remember stepping into the nave, the light spilling faintly from the cracks in the roof. I thought I saw movement between the pews. Not bodies, but the suggestion of them. And I knew then that I was not alone, nor would I ever be again. It was then I realized God had not left me. He had simply gone quiet, the way a man does when he no longer recognizes his own creation. The thaw came late that year. When the snow melted, it revealed more than the ground. It revealed the truth of what I had done. Beneath the soft blackened soil, the graves had shifted. Crosses leaned at strange angles, names washed away by rain. One morning, I found a child's shoe half buried in the mud near the chapel steps. Its leather warped, laces still knotted as if waiting for the foot that would never return. I stood over it for an hour, unable to move. I'd once preached that God saw every sparrow that fell, but I knew now that he had stopped looking long before I closed those chapel doors. The town had changed by then. What few families returned kept their distance, whispering when I passed by. They looked at me the way a man might look at a mirror that shows something he does not wish to see. I did not blame them. I still wore the same coat I had worn during the fever. The sleeves frayed, the hem darkened with the soil of too many graves. My voice had not returned. My sermons were written only in my head now, looping endlessly, unfinished. Once, a widow named Margaret Hale came to my door. Her husband had been among those I buried. She brought bread, still warm, though she did not meet my eyes when she handed it to me. I wanted to thank her, to tell her I remembered his final prayer, but the sound caught in my throat. She left before I could form a single word. When I broke the loaf, it bled crumbs that looked like ash. I could not swallow them. At night, I began to hear hymns outside. Low voices, distant, carried by wind through the bare trees. At first I thought the mourners, but no one came to Harlow after dusk. The melodies were imperfect, like those sung by the sick when fever has blurred the memory of music. I pressed my ear to the chapel door once, and I swear I heard the voices whispering my name between the verses. I tried to pray again. I thought if I humbled myself enough, perhaps heaven would hear. I knelt before the altar and recited the words as best I could remember. "Forgive me," I said, though the words came out dry, brittle as bark. When I opened my eyes, the candle flame bent toward me, not flickering but bending as if drawn by breath. I could not move. For a long moment, I felt as though the chapel itself was exhaling, and I, a trespasser inside its lungs. After that, I no longer lit candles. I let the darkness take its place. I began writing letters, not to the living, but to the ones I had buried. One for each soul. I told them everything I could not say when their bodies still had warmth. I placed the letters beneath their crosses, though most had been swallowed by the ground. When I reached the final grave, the smallest one marked only by a stone, I found my hands trembling so badly that the paper tore. I tried again, but the ink bled through, black veins spreading across the page until the words were unreadable. That night, I burned what was left of them. The smoke rose through the holes in the chapel roof, twisting into the shape of something like wings, or maybe hands. I could not tell. All I know is that I felt lighter afterward, as though the fire had taken a portion of my guilt and carried it upward. But then I remembered, not everything that rises is holy. I slept little after that. The pews creaked with sounds that had no cause, and the air seemed to shift with every breath. I would wake to find the front door open, the lock unbroken. Some mornings I would find footprints in the dust, small ones, leading from the graves to the altar. There were moments when I thought I heard laughter, not cruel, not mocking, only remembering, as if the walls themselves were recalling better days, when hymns still meant hope, and my words still meant salvation. And it was then, as I stood beneath that crumbling ceiling, with dawn bleeding faintly through the cracks, that I understood. Faith does not die in fire or sickness. It dies when a man mistakes his fear for God's will. The frost returned that week, sealing the ground like iron. The graves beneath the chapel hill vanished beneath a crust of white. And for a brief, merciful while, I believed their silence meant peace. But the cold only drives things deeper. It does not kill them. Each night the wind would rise, and I'd hear what sounded like footsteps in the snow. Slow, deliberate, circling the chapel before stopping at my door. Once I thought I saw shadows through the window glass, not moving, not swaying, just standing, as if waiting for me to open. I lit no lamps. I sat in the pew and stared into the dark until dawn washed the frost from the panes. The Bible still lay upon the pulpit, though its pages had grown brittle with damp. When I opened it, the ink had run in places, blurring words into black rivers. But there was one verse still legible. The dead shall hear the voice of the Son of God. I traced the line with my finger until it bled. It felt like a warning, or an invitation. On the seventh night I went outside. The air was sharp, the moon pale and hollow. I carried the oil lamp, though its flame shook with every step. The snow crunched beneath my boots, breaking the perfect silence. I walked to the first grave, Mary Colton's. She'd been 19 when the fever took her, her voice the clearest in the choir. Her cross had fallen, half swallowed by ice. I lifted it back into place. My hand lingered on her name. The wood felt warmer than it should have. I spoke then. For the first time in months, I forced my throat open, pushing sound into the cold air. "I am sorry," I said, though it came out cracked, raw. I did not mean for the wind cut me off. Or perhaps it wasn't wind. It was softer, like breath against the ear, and beneath it faint, the hum of a hymn, one I had not heard since the last Sunday before the fever came. I turned. The graves behind me seemed different now, their outlines faintly raised beneath the snow, as though something stirred beneath them. The lamp flame twisted violently, then steadied. I wanted to run, but my legs refused. Then came the sound, the small, unmistakable sound of a latch falling open. I looked up at the chapel. Its door stood wide, though I had locked it myself. Inside, the darkness looked alive. I stepped forward. Each pace felt heavier than the last. When I reached the threshold, I saw it. Every pew was filled, not with flesh, not with shadow, but with impressions. Faint hollows in the dust, as if bodies had only just risen from them. I could not breathe. The air smelled of earth, and lilac, and something old, something that had waited too long to be remembered. On the altar, the Bible lay open to the same verse. But now the ink shimmered wet again, as though freshly written. The dead shall hear the voice of the Son of God. My voice. That was what they wanted, and so, trembling, I began to preach. No congregation ever listened so intently. I began the sermon with the same trembling cadence I once used in life, the rhythm that had comforted them through drought, through childbirth, through the slow rot of summer heat. My voice, unpracticed after so long in silence, rasped through the chapel like something foreign, dragged up from the earth itself. Dust lifted from the pews in thin veils, swirling with each syllable I forced from my chest. At first, there was only the sound of my own words. Then as my throat cracked, the silence answered. It came softly, almost kindly, the low hum of harmony rising from nowhere. My heart stopped. I knew those voices, every one of them. Mary Colton's high, clear tone above the rest. Old Samuel's baritone beneath it. Children's whispers weaving through the cracks like wind. The congregation I had buried was singing again. The sound grew until the walls themselves seemed to tremble. The hymn, "Abide with me," carried through the rafters as though the dead had found breath enough to mourn themselves. I fell to my knees, clutching the pulpit rail, unable to speak. Yet the sermon continued, through me, without me. Words formed that I did not recall writing. Scripture turned unfamiliar, bent under unseen tongues. For the wages of silence is remembrance. That was not from any Bible I had known. The oil lamp flickered, then flared high. The air shimmered with warmth, though the frost still clung to the window panes. Shadows rippled across the pews, rising and falling in the rhythm of breathing. Then I saw them. Faint outlines forming in the haze, pale figures seated where their bodies once rested. Hollow eyes fixed on me, patient, expectant. I tried to stop. My mouth wouldn't obey. The sermon poured out, fevered, relentless, as if someone else used my lungs. Every verse was wrong, twisted by guilt into new scripture. And he who buries the faithful shall speak until the soil forgets. And his tongue shall not rest until all have risen in memory. Tears burned down my cheeks. My hands trembled against the pulpit, streaked with soot from the lamp. "Please," I whispered, "I did what I could. I buried you because no one else would." For a moment the hymn faltered. Then Mary's voice, clear as morning bells, answered from the dark, "We remember, preacher." I froze. The pews creaked. 100 heads turned toward me in perfect unison. The hymn resumed, quieter now, slower, almost tender, and the temperature in the room fell so sharply I saw my breath bloom like smoke. The flame guttered and died, leaving only the faint silver of moonlight across the altar. And yet their faces remained visible, not solid, not whole, but enough. Eyes like candle wicks still smouldering with life they were never granted. That was when I understood. They had not come for vengeance, not yet. They had come for remembrance, for the words I had withheld when I fled the fever and left their graves untended. They wanted the sermon I had promised them before the sickness took them all. So I preached, until my voice was raw, until the frost crept through the floorboards and numbed my knees. I told them every truth I had buried beside their bones. How I had doubted the sickness was natural. How I had ignored the signs. How I had sealed the chapel not to protect them, but to protect myself. By the time the last word left me, dawn had broken. The pews were empty once more. Only the Bible remained open, its ink dry, its verses clean again. And beneath my hands the wood was warm, pulsing faintly, as though something beneath still listened. When dawn came, it did not rise with warmth. The light that spilled through the chapel windows was grey, thin as mourning cloth, and it fell upon me where I knelt, frozen in the same posture as when the hymn had faded. My knees ached. My lips were cracked. The Bible lay open, but its pages had curled in the damp. I could not recall when I had stopped speaking, or if the sermon had ever truly ended. The air smelled of iron and rain. Outside the world waited, quiet, heavy, almost expectant. I stepped into the yard, and the frost hissed under my boots. The fields stretched out in silence, each mound where I had laid them still marked by wooden crosses, blackened by age and weather. But something was wrong. The soil had shifted. Each grave bore the same disturbance, a faint rise, a loosening, as though the earth had breathed in the night and failed to exhale. The wood on the crosses was split down the middle, and the names I had carved by hand were gone. The rain had washed them away, every name, every mark erased. All but one, my own. At the farthest row, beneath the gnarled oak that leaned like a watcher, stood a new cross. The carving was fresh, the letters precise. Jonah Pierce, 1835. I stared until my vision blurred. My heart pounded with a rhythm older than fear, a kind of recognition, a certainty that the night had not ended but continued, drawn out through daylight to mock me. I wanted to believe it was delirium, a trick of sleeplessness, yet the soil beneath that cross was damp, newly turned. Someone had labored there while I spoke to the dead. I fell to my knees beside it and touched the earth. It was warm. Beneath my palm, I could feel the faintest pulse like a heartbeat through the ground. I whispered a prayer I did not remember learning, not for forgiveness, but for understanding, a plea to whatever lingered in the silence between graves. The wind moved through the cypress and carried the faintest echo of last night's hymn, slow and distant, like voices beneath water. I told myself it was only memory, that the fever that took my congregation had taken something of me too. But then, from the soil itself I heard it, a murmur, a breath. My own name, spoken softly as if by a child. Jonah. I stumbled backward. The ground trembled, only once, only slightly, then stilled. I could hear my pulse roaring in my ears. The church bell, long rusted and useless, gave a single hollow toll without a hand to pull it, and I understood. The graves were not markers of those I had lost. They were promises, unfulfilled prayers I had sealed beneath the dirt. The earth was reminding me that I belonged among them. I turned toward the chapel. The door was open, though I was sure I had closed it. Inside, the pews glowed faintly in the ashen light. On the pulpit, where the Bible had rested, there now lay something else, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. My hand shook as I unwrapped it. It was my own sermon, the same one I had delivered the night before, rewritten in unfamiliar script. The ink was still wet. The final line was new. He who buried his flock shall rest among them, that the silence be complete. The pen lay beside it, its nib broken. I stood there a long time, watching the light fade again, though the day had barely begun. The sound of wind through the eaves grew softer, closer, almost human, like the faint exhale of the graves, aligning themselves in sleep. I felt then that I had already joined them, only my body had yet to understand. That evening, the world dimmed early, as though the sun refused to witness what came next. A dull orange light clung to the trees before it sank behind the hills, and with it went the sound of birds, of insects, of everything living. Only the wind remained, low and mournful, pushing at the chapel door, as if urging me to leave before the darkness began its work. But I did not leave. I could not. My name carved in that cross had become a summons, and each hour that passed felt less like time and more like a confession still unfinished. The graves were waiting, a patient knowing. The earth remembers what the soul forgets. I took the spade from the corner of the shed where I had kept it since the burials. Its handle was smooth, the metal blackened with age and soil. I had buried them all with this same tool. Now its weight felt right in my hands, familiar, inevitable. I made my way to the farthest plot beneath the leaning oak, where my cross stood, clean and bright against the dying light. I stood there for a long while, the spade pressing into the mud. The first thrust came easy, like the earth had been waiting to be opened. The soil was damp, soft, giving way beneath each motion. The smell that rose was not rot, not corruption, but something older, almost sweet. I dug through it slowly, carefully, as though afraid I might disturb a sleeping thing. Each shovelful released faint whispers, like breaths escaping from the cracks in memory. I could not tell if they came from the ground or from my own chest. My hands bled from the splinters in the wood, yet I felt nothing. The night deepened, and with it came a faint glow from the church window behind me, candlelight flickering, though I had not lit any flame. When the spade struck something solid, I stopped. The sound rang low, hollow, too gentle to be stone. My heart faltered. I knelt and brushed the dirt away with my fingers until the shape revealed itself. A coffin lid, simple pine, the same I had built for the others, but this one bore no nameplate, only a single carved mark, the symbol of a cross within a circle, the same sign I had once drawn in the margins of my sermon when I doubted my faith, a mark I'd called the wound of belief. I traced it with my finger. The wood was warm. When I lifted the lid, it did not creak. It opened, as if waiting for my touch. Inside lay a body wrapped in linen, the fabric yellowed, clinging to bone and skin. The air carried the faint scent of oil and dust, the same that filled the chapel when I first came to preach. I leaned closer, trembling, my breath shallow, and I saw my own face, not as it was in youth, nor as I had seen it that morning in the reflection of the chapel glass, but as it would be soon, slack-jawed, hollow-eyed, folded hands clutching a Bible worn thin by touch. The resemblance was beyond comprehension. It was memory sculpted in flesh. The linen shifted with each breath I took as though it mirrored me. I fell backward into the mud, choking on the cold air. My heart stuttered, then steadied. The candlelight from the chapel flickered again, bright and feverish, spilling across the graves. For a moment I thought I saw them all standing there, the congregation I had lost, watching quietly, not with accusation, but with sorrow. Their faces pale, eyes closed, hands folded in prayer, and then, as quickly as the vision came, it was gone. Only the trees remained whispering. The coffin was still open, the figure still there, waiting. I understood then that confession was not spoken for forgiveness. It was spoken to make peace with what already claimed you. I lowered the spade into the earth and began to fill the grave again. Not to bury the body, but to seal the truth. Each shovelful was lighter than the last. I could not tell whether I was burying him or myself. When it was done, I set the spade aside and pressed my hand to the mound. The heartbeat beneath it was gone. Only silence. I looked toward the chapel one last time. The candlelight had gone out. The night had taken everything back. The air did not move after that night's digging. Even the wind seemed to have left the world to its own stillness. My knees trembled as I rose from the grave I had filled, my palms slick with the memory of dirt. The chapel loomed ahead like a hollow ribcage, lightless now, its windows catching only the faint shimmer of starlight. I walked back to it, as though I were returning to a wound. The door, swollen from years of rain, gave way easily beneath my hand. The hinges did not groan. Everything within waited. The pews lined in silence, the pulpit bare except for the Bible that had not been opened since the final service. Dust lay over it like frost, thick and unmoved, preserving the moment I had turned from it forever. I stepped toward the altar. My breath rasped in the still air, slow and uncertain. I remembered how each of them had sat before me, the townsfolk, the families, the children too small to understand sin, but too trusting to refuse my command. I had told them that God had sent a fever to test us, that only those who truly believed should remain in his house, should seal themselves in and wait for redemption, and they did. Every last one. The fever never came. It was hunger that took them, thirst and the still air of faith misplaced. I buried them after, one by one, whispering prayers over each shallow grave, as though words might hide the truth of what I had done. My legs gave out beneath me. I sat upon the cold floorboards, facing the pulpit, where I had once stood proud in my calling. There, behind the lectern, I noticed for the first time a faint outline upon the wall, lighter than the wood around it. I rose again, weak but curious. My fingers traced the shape until they found its edges. It was a door, small, narrow, hidden behind the pulpit's shadow. I had never built such a thing. Yet the latch yielded under my touch. Inside was a narrow stair leading downward into darkness. The smell rose up, mildew, candle soot, and something else. Something old, like earth long sealed away from air. I descended, one hand on the rough wall, the other clutching the Bible that had lain untouched for years. The pages fluttered, as though they too could feel the breath of what waited below. At the bottom the chamber opened wide, a low room carved into the ground itself. Shelves of rotted hymnals lined the walls, and upon a crude table sat the remnants of wax stubs and a cracked chalice. But what caught my eye were the things nailed to the beams above, the remnants of their faith. Ribbons from the children's hair, a worn glove, a rosary broken clean in two. Each relic marked a name I knew. Each name marked a sin I had buried. And then, upon the far wall I saw them, faint carvings in the wood, each letter pressed deep and uneven as though by trembling hands. I stepped closer, raising the Bible to see by its reflection of my candlelight, "Father, forgive us." He would not open the door. The words blurred before my eyes. I fell to my knees. I had told them to pray. I had told them to trust me. And when they begged from inside the locked chapel, when their voices turned raw and frantic, I'd pressed my palms to my ears and told myself that obedience required silence. I began to whisper then, not prayers, but confessions, fragments of memory, words that had waited too long. I was afraid, I said aloud. Afraid that doubt would prove me false. Afraid to hear them die, knowing it was my doing. The candle flickered violently, bending low. I thought I heard a breath, a soft exhale from somewhere behind me. I turned, but there was no one, only the empty chamber, the cross shadow trembling across its walls. And then faintly, from the boards above, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though the congregation had risen for one final sermon. I clutched the Bible to my chest, tears tracing the dirt on my cheeks. "If you are still here," I whispered, "listen. I have come to speak the words I never dared to say aloud." The candle flame steadied. I began to read from the scripture, though my eyes no longer followed the text. The words came as fragments, distorted, but they filled the air like smoke. I spoke until my throat burned, until my voice cracked and broke entirely. Yet the sound above me, the footsteps, did not cease. They were waiting for the final truth. I do not know how long I knelt there, only that time no longer obeyed its name. The candle had dwindled to a trembling seed of light, its wax pooling around my fingers like the slow blood of some wounded thing. The air was heavy, close, as though the earth itself leaned inward to listen. My voice, cracked and ragged, kept spilling words I no longer believed belonged to Scripture. They were mine now, not prayers, but pleas. I spoke to them as though they sat once more before me. I could almost see their faces rising in the flickering dark, the mothers with their folded hands, the old men staring down the long aisle, the children who never lived to learn doubt. They were there, I swear it, not ghosts, not visions, but memory itself made whole. Their eyes, hollow with the calm that comes after judgment, fixed upon me as though waiting for the one thing I had always denied them, an apology. "I thought I was saving you," I said. "I thought God demanded proof of our devotion. I thought silence was faith." My voice broke on that word. Faith. It had become a hollow sound, one that echoed without weight. The candle hissed, a tiny sigh of surrender, and I was left in darkness that felt deeper than blindness. I reached out, searching for the table, the wall, anything. but my hand found only the chill breath of the room itself. Then came the sound, not footsteps this time, but the creak of pews shifting above, wood straining under invisible weight. It was the sound of them sitting again, waiting for me to speak. The air carried the faint scent of oil and hymns, and beneath it the iron taste of decay. My lips trembled. "If you still hear me," I whispered, "then let this be my last sermon." There was no pulpit now, no congregation to gaze upon, only the dark and the memory of my own voice. I began to tell them everything, every deceit wrapped in scripture, every doubt buried beneath sermons. Every time I told myself that obedience was holy, while mercy was weakness. The words poured like ashes, and with each confession, the darkness seemed to draw closer, warm and heavy, as though forgiving or consuming. I could not tell which. I spoke of the night I locked them in, of the nails I drove into the church doors to keep them safe from a plague that never came. I told them how I listened to their cries fade into prayers, how I kept reading Psalms until the silence returned, convincing myself that they had ascended. But they had not. They had starved in the name of my certainty, and I, their shepherd, had become their tomb. At last, the Bible slipped from my grasp. It fell open upon the stone floor, its pages fluttering though there was no wind. My hand followed it, trembling. Resting on a passage, my eyes could not see, but my heart still knew. And he called the place Bochim, and they sacrificed there unto the Lord. I had spoken of sacrifice so many times. Now I understood it was never meant for others. It was always meant for me. I laid myself upon the cold earth, the same that held their bones above. My heart fluttered weakly, a failing clock winding down. In the distance I thought I heard a hymn rising, faint, slow, as though sung through water. It was the same melody we had sung the morning before they died. Tears slipped into my hair. If mercy still lives, I breathed, let them rest where I could not. For a moment the hymn swelled, dozens of voices, pure and weightless, and then faded into a sound like the turning of soil. The candle went out, and I saw for the briefest instant the shape of light where none should be, hands reaching down, not in wrath, but in acceptance. The earth was cool against my cheek. My breath grew shallow, then still. Above, dawn would come to the valley, touching the chapel roof and the unmarked graves behind it. Perhaps someone, one day, would wander upon them and wonder who had prayed so hard that even death remembered. But no one would know my name. Only the silence would remain, sealed beneath the floorboards of that ruined church. And there, beneath the weight of my own creation, I finally found what I had chased all my life. Not forgiveness, only quiet.